because in order to actually memorize the structures around the heart, remember on the MBLEx you're responsible for the larger structures of the heart, but not the smaller ones. So the larger ones means the major vessels, the arteries and veins going into and out of the heart chambers, as well as the chambers themselves, the valves. And you're going to need to know which side is oxygenated and which side is deoxygenated. Right. So I think saying these things is really important. So just repeat after me under your breath or silently to yourself, but definitely mouth the words so you get that motor input from your brain. So on the right side, it's the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava that come into the right atrium. Superior vena cava and inferior vena cava come into the right atrium. And from the right atrium, the blood goes through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it goes through the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary artery. From the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary artery. From the left, from the pulmonary artery, it goes to the lungs. Once it reaches the lungs, the blood gives off carbon dioxide and picks up or absorbs oxygen. And then it returns through the veins, through the pulmonary veins to the heart. So it goes through the pulmonary veins and it comes into the left atrium. And then from the left atrium, it passes through the mitral valve into the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, it goes through the aortic valve through the aorta. And then from the aorta, it goes out to the rest of the heart. Remember superior and inferior vena cava and the aorta with the ascending and descending parts of the aorta. Those are to feed the upper and the lower parts of the body, to oxygenate the upper and the lower parts of the body. The right side, say this after me, the right side receives deoxygenated blood and sends deoxygenated to the lungs. The left side receives oxygenated blood and sends the oxygenated blood out to the body. The right side receives deoxygenated blood from the body and sends it to the lungs. The left side receives oxygenated blood in the lungs and sends it out to the body. If you just go over the major structures, you can say superior, inferior vena cava. So please be repeating this after me. Superior, inferior vena cava, right atrium, left ventricle, right atrium, right ventricle, pulmonary artery, then to the lungs, and then pulmonary vein, left atrium, left ventricle, and then aorta. And then you just have to fill in the blanks for the valves. But if you do that a few times, superior, inferior vena cava, right atrium, left atrium, pulmonary artery, pulmonary vein, left atrium, left ventricle, aorta. If you do that a few times, that cycle, it should get easier. Let's try that like two times and then we'll move on, okay? Superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, right atrium. Right atrium, right ventricle. Right ventricle, pulmonary artery. Lungs, pulmonary vein, left atrium. Left atrium, left ventricle. Left ventricle, aorta. Okay, again like that. And then we're gonna do it a little bit more continuously. Superior, inferior vena cava, right atrium. Right atrium, left ventricle. I'm sorry, right atrium, right ventricle, not left. Right atrium, right ventricle. Right ventricle, pulmonary artery, lungs. Lungs, pulmonary veins, left atrium. Left atrium, left ventricle, aorta. Okay, and now let's do the entire right side and then the entire left side without stopping. So superior, inferior vena cava, right atrium, right ventricle. Superior, inferior vena cava, right atrium, right ventricle. Right ventricle, pulmonary artery, lung. Right ventricle, pulmonary artery, lung. Lung, pulmonary vein, left atrium, left ventricle. Lung, pulmonary vein, left atrium, left ventricle. Left ventricle, aorta. All right, and then you fill in the blanks. So for the valves, right? So it's superior, inferior vena cava into the right atrium. Right atrium goes to the right ventricle. Between them is the tricuspid valve. Right ventricle into the pulmonary artery. Between them is the pulmonary valve. Blood goes to the lungs. It returns through the pulmonary vein. Pulmonary vein into the left atrium. Left atrium into the left ventricle. Between the atrium and the ventricle is the bicuspid or the mitral valve. BMW, bicuspid or mitral valve, or BMV. And then from the left ventricle, it goes into the aorta, passing through the aortic valve. Please let me know if there's any questions about that or if any of that is unclear. And I think we are ready to move on. Let's see. I think we got everything from last time. Oh, I don't think we went over this. Yeah. So so one of the learning objectives is to understand the blood's role in healing. And you know, the FSMTB, they're a little bit like intentionally broad, non-specific about things sometimes, and other things they're really specific about. But this is one of those things where they're a little broad, a little vague. So in healing, every structure in the blood, every component in the blood has a function. Remember, the components of blood are platelets, and then red blood cells or erythrocytes, erythro meaning red and cyte meaning cell, plasma, white blood cells or leukocytes, leuko meaning white and cyte meaning cell, and then hemoglobin. And in healing, whether it is a muscle tear, which is a strain, or a ligament or joint capsule tear, which is a sprain, or whether it's a fracture or a bruise or a cut or an infection, the first response that has to happen comes from the platelets. If there is any extravasation of blood outside the blood vessels, for example, if you have a muscle tear or a bone bruise or a fracture or a bruise or a cut, all those involve broken capillaries or some kind of broken blood vessel. And when they break open, when they're torn open, they allow blood to seep out, and they go into the spaces between the structures and then between the cells in the interstitial spaces. So that blood gets stuck there and creates pressure. The pressure prevents fresh blood from coming in, and also causes quite a bit of pain. And you know, you need fresh blood in order to get red blood cells and white blood cells there to do their work, to break down and build up the area. So if there is some kind of bleeding, some kind of extravasation of blood in the area, the first thing that has to happen is that has to stop. So the first thing that the body needs to do is coagulation, or to start hemostasis. So hemo means blood, and stasis means being still, right? Stasis, static, no movement. So the platelets are responsible for creating blood clotting, or blood hemostasis, or coagulation. Once there is a clot there, once there is coagulation there, then red blood cells can come in and they can bring fresh oxygen, and they can carry away carbon dioxide and waste. There's you know, we're skipping over like a lot of the really smaller biochemical processes, We don't need those for the MBLEx. And this is actually a good level for most practitioners to learn, in my opinion. So the platelets create blood clots, or they clot the blood, or they initiate hemostasis, or coagulation. They also begin inflammation, the platelets. And inflammation is good because inflammation brings water and plasma to the area, and it brings blood. So it's plasma and blood and fluids, and all of that stuff has living cells like erythrocytes that carry in oxygen and bind to carbon dioxide and other waste products and bring them out. Erythrocytes later on in the healing, like in the second, third stage of healing, erythrocytes also have a mechanism by which they reduce inflammation, but that's only when the body's ready. In this initial stage of healing, the body needs inflammation. At the same time that the red blood cells are coming in, the white blood cells are coming in, and they're checking out the area, making sure that there's no microbes, no invaders, protecting the area from infection. Recall that hemoglobin is the protein that carries the oxygen in the erythrocytes. And recall that plasma, the role of plasma is to bring in everything that the body needs. So that's clotting factors to help hemostasis, nutrients, those are the basic building blocks of the tissues, as well as the living cells that we've been discussing, and to carry out waste products. So the platelets cause clotting and inflammation. I left this out. Blood vessels dilate. Blood vessels dilate after that. And they bring in red blood cells and white blood cells. The red blood cells start to bring in oxygen and carry out carbon dioxide. White blood cells deal with infection if there is any. Meanwhile, the plasma is also bringing in addition to the red and white blood cells, it's bringing in clotting factors, other nutrients necessary to repair the area, and it's taking out waste products. And the hemoglobin in the red blood cells is the protein that carries oxygen. All right, I'm going to pause for a second, and as we're going over the muscles, please be touching the muscles that I'm talking about. Can you guys see my screen? Can you see my screen? Can someone say yes?
Yes.
Yes, we can see.
Thank you. Okay, so this is the leg. There are two parts to the leg. There's the upper part, which is called the upper leg, and then there's a lower part, which is called the lower leg. Together, they make up the lower limb. So the leg is the lower limb, and from the shoulder out to the hand, that's the upper limb. So you have an upper leg and a lower leg, and those two make up the lower limb. This is looking at it from the side. Always try to get oriented. You can tell it's the side because you can see the ASIS here. You can see the anterior superior iliac spine right here, and there's a bone, right? So that's the hip bone. And if you go down a little bit, there's a bone here. That's the greater trochanter of the femur. So this is the ilium. Remember, the pubic bone has two parts. Here's the ilium on the top, and the ischium would be on the bottom, where the sits bone is. And then the femur goes into the fossa in the pelvis. The fossa is called the glenoid. So it's the, no, that's the shoulder. The fossa is called the acetabulum. So it's the femoroacetabular joint or the acetabular femoro joint. Acetabular femoro joint, yeah. As long as you remember acetabulum or acetabular or femur or femoro, you're in good shape. You can also tell this is the side of the leg because of this big white structure here. This is the iliotibial tract or the IT band. The IT band. You can see here's a bone here. That's the patella, which is facing toward the left. There's a little bony structure here, which is the fibula. The fibula is covered by this muscle here, the peroneus longus. It's also called the one of the extensor muscles. I'll look that up for you later. And then you can see the outer edge or the lateral edge of the foot. Right here's the pinky toe, so that's lateral, and here's the big toe or the great toe, so that's the medial portion. So this is the side. This is looking at it from the front. This is the anterior view. You can see this bone here is the tibialis anterior. I'm sorry, the tibia. Tibialis anterior is a muscle, not a bone. So you should be repeating these after me, right? So here's the tibia. In front is the patella. Here's the IT band on the side, the IT band. And over here, I'll just throw this one in. This is the sartorius. And here's an interesting structure called the pes anserinus, which we'll learn about a little bit later. And here's the iliac, or the front part of the pelvis. And they've included this cartilaginous disc, which is the pubic symphysis. And then here is, what is it? This is the back, right? So here's part of the hip bone, part of the pelvis. Can't really tell what part it is yet until I go down and I see, okay, there's a triangle, so triangle or trapezoid, so that's the sacrum. And there's the greater trochanter. So hip bone facing me and greater trochanter to the side. That means this is either the front or the back. And if I look at the muscles, I can see this is the glute max with the IT band on the side. So this has got to be posterior view. Here is the pes anserinus. That's the same muscle from, I'm sorry. Here is the sartorius muscle. That's the same muscle that's over here. And then here are the medial hamstrings, the semitendinosus. I only know it's a medial hamstring right now because I'm looking at it, because I'm looking at the label. But you can tell because of how close together these tendons are. So there's the semitendinosus. This must be the semimembranosus. And then over here is the biceps femoris. Now down below are the gastrocnemius muscle, and underneath, deep to the gastroc and below the gastroc is the soleus muscle. Here's the thickest tendon in the body, the Achilles tendon. And this is the posterior of the foot. So we're seeing the calcaneus down here. All right, so let's go back to the front. So in the front, they definitely want you to know the larger muscle groups. You don't have to know all the specific insertions, origins and insertions, but it's good if we touch on them, right? Because it really helps to know which end of the muscle is stable and which end of the muscle moves a limb. So up here, where all these muscles are attaching to the ilium, is this bone going to, are these muscles going to be moving this bone, or are they going to be stable to this bone, stable against this bone?
Stable to the.
Yes, stable to the bone, attached to the bone. This is the bone that's not moving, stable against the bone. Yes, exactly. Okay, and then at the other end, see these same muscles, they attach to the femur. Right, they're coming down and they're attaching to this bone, which you cannot see, but it's because it's deep to the muscles. But this is the femur, and remember the femur has this big joint here, the femoroacetabular joint. So this is the bone that's going to be moving. This is the bone that's going to be moving. Okay, so these are the adductor group along with the pectineus. The pectineus is it's the one that I usually forget, so I assume other people forget it. Here's the adductor longus right here. So pectineus, adductor longus, and then gracilis. And then the adductor magnus is an important one. The adductor magnus is deeper inside, and so you can't really see it. If we look at if we look at just the adductor group, what you see is the adductor magnus right here, right? It attaches to the back of the pelvis. See, this is the ischium. So here's the sit bone down here, right? So this is like the posterior, literally your posterior. And there's the adductor magnus. Below it is the adductor brevis, adductor longus, and then the adductor, oh yeah, adductor magnus has two branches, one here and one here. I'm sorry. And over it are the brevis and longus, and then medial to the adductor magnus is the gracilis. The pectineus, again, attaches to the ischium, and then inserts or moves the femur bone, right? So you can see that this is more forward. This is on the forward part of the pelvis. That's the ischium, that's the ilium, and the adductor magnus attaches to the ischium, which is the posterior part of the pelvis. So the pectineus would be over it. Now, if we go back to the other drawing, so again, this is from the front. So you can see this being the pectineus, and this being the adductor longus. This being, yeah, pectineus, adductor longus, and then gracilis. You can imagine that this is the front of the bone. You can imagine that the posterior aspect of the pelvis, which is the ischium, is underneath all these muscles. It's behind all these muscles. Is that unclear to anybody? So here's the front of the pelvis, the ilium, and then here's the back of the pelvis, the ischium. And if that is unclear, then what you can do is you can touch your ASIS and then touch your PSIS, or I'm sorry, touch your sit bone, and you should be able to visualize pretty easily that way. The ilium is in the front, the ischium is in the back, right? So the ASIS, ischium is in the front, and then the sit bone, ischium is in the back. Ilium in the front, ischium in the back. I keep reversing those two. I apologize. So you cannot see the adductor magnus, although it definitely is one of the more important muscles of the adductor group. Also part of the adductor group are the acilis, the gracilis, the adductor longus, and the pectineus. I'm actually a little bit nervous. I don't know why. So can you guys unmute yourselves for a second? And I'm going to cover these names and let's see how much you retain. So can you guys name the largest muscle of the adductor group?
Glorious.
Well, the largest would be in its name, which is magnus, right? Magnus means magnum means the biggest, right? So adductor magnus. So once again, the muscles that we have in the adductor group are the adductor magnus, adductor longus, gracilis, and pectineus. We also have adductor brevis. But what is the longest? Is it the adductor magnus, pectineus, gracilis, or adductor longus?
Adductor longus.
Adductor longus. That's right. That's right. You guys remember which one is the shorter of the two? Is it the pectineus muscle or the gracilis muscle?
The pectineus.
That's right. The pectineus is the shorter. Here's the pectineus, and here's the gracilis. The gracilis is really long. You can feel, I don't know if you can feel the pectineus. I think you can, but you can definitely feel the gracilis on the inside. If you put your hand on the inside of your thigh and you squeeze your knees together, the gracilis is a very thin muscle right underneath the skin, Okay, good. So one more time, just repeat after me silently if you want to, or out loud if you prefer. Adductor magnus, adductor longus, adductor brevis, pectineus, and gracilis. Pectineus and gracilis. Great. So that's the adductor group. The adductor group.
Okay.
Let's look at the quads. So in the quadriceps, the one that we usually miss is the one that's under the rectus femoris. So here's the rectus femoris, and underneath it is the vastus intermedius. On the outside, next to the IT band, is the vastus lateralis, and on the inside, next to the sartorius muscle, is the vastus medialis.
Is the intermedius one labeled on there? I don't see it.
No, it's not. It's not. I have to pull up a separate visual for that. So here it's just the vastus medialis, vastus lateralis, rectus femoris. If we look at the quadricep muscles, we have to find one which shows all four muscles. Yeah, see, like for example, this one, it says vastus intermedius not visible. So most places they just leave it out. Okay, here we go. That's kind of a crappy visual. So okay, let me give you guys a couple, right? And then hopefully your brain will take the kind of the median of everything. Okay, here's the rectus femoris. That's the one we think of as the thigh muscle proper. It's like the middle of the thigh. And then on the outside would be the vastus lateralis. On the inside is the vastus medialis. Vastus lateralis, vastus medialis. And then underneath this rectus femoris, if we cut it up here, if we cut it at the ilium and cut it down here above the patella and take it off, underneath we can see the vastus intermedius, So 3 vastus muscles and 1 rectus femoris. So kind of interesting thing that you're not going to have to know, I don't think, is that the rectus femoris is the only one of the 3 that attaches to the ilium. I didn't actually know that, but it does make sense now that the rectus femoris is the main one that moves the femur, so femoris, right? Rectus femoris, and then the other 3, they actually attach to the femur and then to the patella or the tibia. So their main goal, their main function is to move the knee. They act on the knee for the most part. So pretty interesting.
So
yes.
are the adductors deeper than all these?
The adductors, the adductor magnus is posterior. I would say that the adductors, the adductor longus, pectineus, gracilis, adductor brevis, they're not deeper, they're medial. So here's the midline. Let me know if you don't see any of the structures, right? Here's the midline.
Yeah.
And the adductors, if you draw a triangle from the greater trochanter down to the knee and up to the midline, see that triangle?
Yeah.
That triangle is where the adductors are. So that they'd be attaching here like this. And the adductor mag is from the back and comes down and attaches like that.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's look at one more rendering of the vastus intermedialis. And then we'll move on. Wow, this looks like an alien. It's kind of cool. Okay, so you have the rectus femoris. What's on the outside? What's on the lateral portion?
Vastus lateralis.
Yes, and now someone else. What's on the medial side?
Vastus medialis.
Good, and then the one in the middle is the vastus what?
Intermedius.
Yeah. Seems like you guys have that pretty good. Seems like you have that pretty good. Okay. A couple other little things that while we're in the area of the quads that I want you to take a look at are this muscle over here, the tensor fascia lata, TFL, tensor fascia lata. Tensor fascia lata. And I always forget all the functions that the TFL does. Let's see, so it's an abductor. It takes the leg away from the midline. It's an abductor. And it also helps to stabilize the leg. Let's see, what are the abductor group? Oh, it's giving me the adductors. It's funny. So we'll go over the abductors in a moment, but notice the tensor fascia lata on the side. Here's part of the gluteus medius wrapping around anterior superior iliac spine. Here's the adductor group you were asking about earlier. Wrapping over them is the sartorius muscle. The sartorius muscle is interesting. If you guys can see me, sartorius muscle is interesting because since it wraps around the inside of the knee, it pulls the knee up. So it's both a hip flexor and it externally rotates the knee like this. So because it helps you get into this position, it sometimes is called the tailor's muscle, because tailors used to sit like this and put the cloth over the knee and then work the cloth that way. Sartorius is one of the longest muscles in the body. Beautiful. And then the tendons are pretty important, just so you understand how all these muscles relate to the kneecap and the knee. The tendons are pretty important. So here's a thick tendon that attaches to the patella from the quadriceps, from the from the rectus femoris and the vastus group. But it's called the quadriceps tendon, and then the one below it is called the patellar ligament. So if it's called, and the name should give you a clue that the quadriceps tendon is bone to muscle, and the patellar ligament is bone to bone. And on the side, of course, you have the iliotibial tract, or the IT band. And this is just the upper leg. We haven't gotten to the lower leg yet. Okay, if we look on the posterior aspect, let's go to the side actually. So here's the tensor fascia lata muscle that I mentioned earlier. That's one of the hip abductors. The glute med, I believe, is also an abductor and a stabilizer. Glute max in the back, that does extension, so it takes the leg back behind. Let's see, you can see the iliotibial tract, or the IT band, and you can see part of the muscles in the quadriceps group. So you can see the rectus femoris in the front and the vastus lateralis. Here's the kneecap, and you can see the lateral hamstring, which is the biceps femoris. Biceps meaning two heads, right? Biceps femoris. Biceps brachii up top. Brachii or brachius refers to the humerus. I don't know why the humerus is referred to as the brachius, but maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Okay, so on the side, the structures that you really need to watch out for are above this joint. What's the name of this joint? It's a combination of femur. What's that?
Fascia?
This joint is a combination of two bony structures. The femur is one, and the other one is the acetabulum. Everybody say acetabulum. 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 Repetition is the mother of learning. Let's go. Acetabulum.
Yeah, acetabulum.
Last time. Acetabulum.
Acetabulum.
Yes. I definitely have seen acetabulum in testing sites. Femoroacetabular joint, or acetabular femoro joint. So so again, it's the tensor fascia lata, the gluteus medius, glute max, and then below the hip joint, below the femoroacetabular joint, the structures of the IT band, the quadriceps, and then the biceps femoris in the back. Okay, and then if we go over to, so this is the outside, the lateral side, this is the anterior portion, this is the posterior portion. If we go over to the posterior portion, again, we see the glute med, and then we see the gluteus maximus. Here's the femur, the greater trochanter of the femur. On the side, you can see the IT band, and then in the back, you see biceps femoris, semitendinosus, and then semimembranosus underneath the tendinosus. And I just call the semitendinosus, semimembranosus, I just call those the semi-sisters, because it's easier to remember things that are it's more memorable than tendinosus, membranosus. On the inside, further on the inside, you can see part of the adductor group, which is the gracilis. I don't know what muscle this is. This may be the adductor magnus. I'm not sure. Here's the gracilis, and remember your bony landmarks. So here's the posterior aspect of the ilium. This is the anterior aspect of the ilium. posterior aspect of the ilium and the sacrum, right? Here's the glute. So right in here should be what bone? What bone is right here? If this is the ilium and the sacrum, what bone is this? It's the posterior bottom aspect of the hip or of the pelvis. What is that? Not the ilium, but its counterpart, which is the
Ischium.
ischium. That's right. So the ischium should be here. So it makes sense that this might be the adductor mag, and there's the gracilis. So glute med, which you can also see from the side. Here's the glute med. Here's the glute max from the side. Glute med, glute max, greater trochanter, IT band. Biceps femoris, semisisters, tendinosus on top, membranosus on underneath, adductor mag, gracilis. Yeah, okay. I don't think we have to get too much into insertions, but I do want you guys to just notice that that the semitendinosus and the gracilis, and I think the sartorius also, they come together and they form one tendon down on the inside. This is the medial aspect of the leg. See, here's the lateral aspect with the pinky and the greater trochanter. Here's the medial aspect with the sacrum. And you can't see it, but the great toe would be over here. So the semimembranosus, tendinosus, the gracilis, they form a structure called the pes anserinus, the duck leg, the duck foot. Pes is foot and serinus is duck. Pes anserinus, and that inserts onto the medial aspect of the tibia. And on the outside, you have the IT band, which also comes over and inserts on the lateral aspect of the tibia. And together, those two sort of brace these lateral and medial soft tissue structures on the tibia. So it's just interesting. You don't really have to know that. Okay. Now let's do the muscles of the lower leg. And I think that's going to do it for like introduction to the muscles for today. Oh no, wait, I'm sorry. We have to finish up with the abductors. Abductors. So let's see, which ones are the hip abductors? The hip, no, there's no hip. I'm putting in abductor and it's showing me a deductor. Hip abductors, Physiopedia, what a great site. Let's see. So the muscles that abduct the hip, or that is to say abduct the femur at the hip, they include the muscles which we've already reviewed, the gluteus medius and the gluteus medius and the tensor fascia lata, gluteus medius and the tensor fascia lata. And if you look at the drawing, that kind of makes sense, right? Because the tensor fascia lata and the gluteus medius are on the side. They're on the side. So their attachment is on the ischium, right? Or ilium, on the ilium. The ilium's not going to move, right? It's the femur that's going to move. They attach on the ischium and then they insert, that would be inserting onto the femur or onto part of the IT band and part of the greater trochanter. And then the glute min is one that we did not, the glute min is one that we did not take a look at. So the gluteus minimus is buried, I don't think you're going to be able to see it. Yeah. Okay, the gluteus minimus is buried deep underneath the glute med and the glute max. So here's the glute med that's cut away. It would be lying over like this. And here's the glute max that's cut away and it would be lying over like this. Let's look at those again. So glute med and glute max. Here's from the back, the glute med and the glute max. And underneath this glute med, deep inside here would be the glute min. So underneath this glute med, almost the same shape as the glute med, would be the glute min underneath the glute med. There's another drawing of it. It shows the outline and it shows the muscle belly. Glute med would be here. Glute min is underneath. The glute min is here. The glute med would be above that. and the glute max would be in the back. Okay, so hip abductors. The AB ductors are a little in their function are a little complicated, so I'm not going to go too much more into things like the piriformis, for example, plays a role. So these muscles being on the side, the glute med, glute min, and the tensor fascia lata, they abduct. And that makes sense because they're on the side. And the adductors are on the medial aspect. They're on the inside. So they bring the leg toward the inside or toward the midline. The glute max and the hamstrings, they're on the back. So it makes sense that they would bring the leg toward the back. That's for extension. And then the thigh muscles being in the front, quadriceps being in front, they bring the leg to the front. That's hip flexion. All right, let's look at the lower leg unless there's any questions. So this has just the right number of muscles that I almost always see in all of the like reading materials. In the posterior aspect compartment of the leg, there's like 9 muscles. They don't list them all, and you don't need to know them all. The ones you have to know are the gastroc, which is what most people think of as like the power muscle in the back. In fact, the soleus, which is underneath it, is more powerful. If we look at just an image of the soleus muscle, you get an idea of like how powerful it is, because it's really thick, it's really wide. The gastrocs lay over it. Here's, yeah. It's like, look how wide it is at its widest point. Like we think of this as the calf. It makes up a lot of the calf. It's just deep underneath. And the soleus is the analog to the brachialis muscle, which is underneath the biceps. So I won't go too much into this, but underneath the biceps, there is a muscle similar to the soleus, and that's called the brachialis muscle. So here's the brachialis muscle here. And then here's the biceps over the brachialis. The brachialis muscle is deep underneath. And here's the soleus muscle deep underneath the glute, the gastrocs. Oh, I'm downloading this thing by mistake. Okay, and here's the gastrocs over top of the soleus muscle. Soleus muscle. So the gastrocs is on top. Soleus, or the gastrocs, is the most shallow. Soleus is the deeper of the two. And those are in the posterior compartment. Those are primarily the two that you need to know for the posterior compartment. They may ask you about a couple of the other muscles. The flexor hallucis longus, which has a tendon that comes down on the inside, on the medial aspect. And they may ask about a muscle or two of the foot, which is, they may ask about the flexor hallucis brevis. But if you can remember flexor hallucis longus, and brevis, that will really help you. The hallux is the toe. So that should tell you where the tendons go. The tendons go down into the toe. On the side, the muscle, yeah.
What does brevis mean?
Oh, okay. So muscles are named by their shape and by their strength and by where they attach. And what they do, how they move. So brevis means brief or short, right? And brevis is kind of the opposite of longus. So flexor hallucis brevis is the short flexor hallucis muscle, and flexor hallucis longus is the long flexor hallucis muscle. And then as we saw in the abductors and as we saw in the adductors, we have the adductor magnus adductor longus, adductor brevis, right? So the magnus is like the big one, longus is the long one, the brevis is the short one. So here's the flexor hallucis longus and flexor hallucis brevis. So this is the big toe, the hallux, 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 the hallux. And the flexor hallucis longus is in the back. So the soleus would be over top of this and the gastrocs would be up here. The flexor hallucis longus, or the FHL, is in the back, and the tendon crosses from the lateral portion of the lower leg to the medial portion of the heel, and it runs along the bottom, the plantar surface of the hallux. Flexor hallucis longus, it's the long one that attaches to the hallux. The flexor hallucis brevis is right underneath, so the flexor hallucis brevis would be right here. It's right underneath the foot. It attaches to, I don't know what bones these are, attaches to the midfoot, and then inserts or attaches to the hallux. So the flexor hallucis longus tendon would be like this underneath the flexor hallucis brevis. And that may be, I'm glad you asked, because one of the MBLEx questions is, how are muscles named? And they'll give you a few options, for their length, their size, for their shape. For example, deltoid muscle, triangle muscle, versus rectus, which is like a long up and down muscle, or for where they go, right? So rectus versus oblique, or for what bone they attach to or what bone they move. So like the hallux is a good example of that.
In
Yes.
terms of the muscle fibers, how do you think we should go about memorizing those?
Do you mean where they insert and attach, or do you mean which ones are long rectus type muscles and which ones are feather pennate type muscles and which ones are round?
I guess, yeah, the attachments and also like the way that the muscle fibers, like the direction that they're going.
Okay, so all that. So the muscle fiber shape, like whether it's round or straight or feather shaped, we can go over that today. That's in your MBLEx March 2023 basics. As far as the origin and insertion, I need to look up what you're actually expected to know for the MBLEx. I don't think that you're expected to know all of those.
Okay.
Okay, but just as a rule of thumb, first of all, you need to look at you need to go to Google and put in biceps brachii, right? You need to go and actually look at a picture of the muscle, and then you have to think, okay, I see the two heads of the muscle, and there's a tendon here, and there's a tendon here, and then there's a tendon down here. So if I look at it with the shoulder, it's a little tricky because all this shit moves, right? All this stuff above and below, it all moves. With the hip, it's a little bit clearer because you look at the hip and you know that this part is not going to move as much as the femur. But that's what you have to discern. You have to discern which end is likely the more stable and which end is likely the more mobile, according to how this muscle is laid out. Right. So
Okay, that makes sense.
yeah. So you may not be able to tell so much with the shoulder, but with this tendon here that attaches to the coracoid process of the scapula, I think that's the coracoid. The scapula is going to be more stable compared to the forearm, the radius.
Yeah.
And then if you look at this tendon that goes through the biceps notch in the let's see, glenohumeral joint in the humerus. If you look at this tendon of the biceps that goes through the glenoid valley or goes through the biceps tendon of the humerus, you may be able to tell that would pull the humerus this way. It would actually flex the humerus a little bit, but there's also an attachment down here, I think, to the ulna, and it would move that one a lot more. So it can be a little tricky with the two heads of the biceps, But most muscles, if you look at them, you can tell right away, like what's going to move and what's not going to move. Like the flexor hallucis longus, it attaches up here to the, let's see, I always have to do things in pairs or have other reference points. So I don't know what this bone is right off the top of my head. So I have to say, okay, the two lower leg bones are the tibia and the fibula. So it attaches to the fibula. And I know that the fibula has the larger malleolus, the lateral malleolus. So now I'm oriented. So you know these muscle fibers are not going to move. This bone is not going to move. These bones are going to move, right? So this is the origin and insertion. But I don't think that you have to worry quite so much about that, but I'll look it up for you. What you should look at right away is the surface. So what surface is this? The front or back of the lower leg? Front or back?
The front.
It's the back.
It's-
See the heel?
it's
See
Oh,
the
that's
heel?
the back.
Back.
Yeah, see the heel? It's kind of hard to tell because the toes are pointing down. The skeleton is actually plantar flexed. So it's a little hard to tell. If this were flat on the floor, it would be easier to tell. If it looked more like this, it would be easier to tell. But the foot is like flaccid there. Plantar flexed. But this is the back. So if you understand that this is on the back, which way do you think this muscle might move the ankle and foot? Plantar flexion or dorsiflexion?
Dorsiflexion.
Plantar flexion. Plantar flexion.
Okay.
So touch the muscle on the back of your, can you guys see me? Can you see me?
Yes.
Yeah.
So touch
Yeah.
the muscle on the posterior aspect of your lower leg, and then plantar flex, point your foot. Feel those muscles working?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then touch the muscles on the front, on the shin. And tell me right now, if you're looking at the skeleton from the front, which way do you think the muscles on the front of the shin are going to move the foot? Plantar flexion or dorsiflexion?
Dorsey.
Also,
Dorsiflexion, that's right.
Dorsiflexion.
And which way would the muscles on the front of the shin move the knee? Would they extend the knee or would they flex the knee?
extend.
That's right. That's right. And if you look at the muscles on the side, so here's the muscles on the side of the lower leg. Here's the fibula. Here's the kneecap or the patella. Here's the lateral border of the foot. So what are they going to do to the ankle if they're on the side, these peroneal muscles? Are they going to evert or invert?
Invert.
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 Invert, that's right, that's right. And the muscles on the medial aspect, like the medial aspect of the soleus and the gastroc, what do you think they will do to the ankle? Invert or evert?
Invert.
Invert.
That's right. That's right. So now you got the back, the front, the lateral, and the medial aspect, and you have several movements. You have you understand now several movements. You understand the dorsa and plantar flexion of the ankle, the inversion and eversion of the ankle. That's almost all there is for the ankle. It is a gliding joint as well, but that's a different story. Extension and flexion of the knee, right? So then if you look at the muscles on the side, they're probably going to move the leg which way? To the side, to the front, or to the back? If you look at the hip muscles on the side, like the glute med and the
To the side.
they'll move it to the side. What's
To
the
the
side
side.
movement called? Adduction or abduction?
AB.
Abduction.
Abduction, that's right. And then muscles attached to the hip and the leg that are on the front, are they going to move the leg to the front or the back when they shorten?
To the front.
They'll move it
To the front.
That's called what at the hip? Flexion or extension?
Flexion.
Flexion.
And what at the knee? Flexion or extension?
Extension.
That's right. Very good.
Yeah.
You guys are, I think you guys may know a little bit more than you think you do, which is always good. And then the muscles on the back. So that's the glute max, and then the biceps and the semi what? What are those called? The semi what?
Semi-sisters.
Semi sisters. That's right. Semi sisters. Which way are they going to move the leg? Toward the front or the back?
The back.
Back.
And what is that called? Hip extension or hip
Yeah.
flexion?
Hip extension.
And what about the
Extension,
knee? Is that flexion or extension of the knee?
flexion,
Flexion.
no extension.
Extension.
Of the knee, the muscles in the back would close the knee joint as the muscles shorten, which would be flexion, not extension.
Flexion, okay,
Flexion, yeah.
flexion, right, because then,
Yes, yes. So hopefully that helps you guys. When you see a question that says, a soccer player is kicking a ball straight out in front of her, I want you to think right away, the leg is moving to the front of the body. And the shin or the lower leg or the knee is extending. So that's the muscles in the front. And then you have to break it down further than that into the muscles in the front. Well, that's the iliopsoas, iliacus, and the rectus femoris, or the hip flexor and the quads. And they'd be shortening in a concentric way, and the ones in the back, the glute max and the biceps femoris semis, or the hamstrings, would be shortening in an eccentric way. Okay, we'll go over that again. Would you guys like to take a break?
yeah,
Do I hear the whimpering of yes,
yeah,
or do I hear the calls for no mercy? Okay, guys, take a break. Well, it's 12:05. Come back at 12:15. Okay, so in your MBLEx folder, if you go down to FSMTB, you'll find these guides, and I owe you 3 or 4 more, but the ones we're looking at are kinesiology, anatomy, and physiology today. I'm just using a bigger version here on my laptop. So in the FSMTB e-study guide or e-guide for the MBLEx, the kinesiology section starts with an introduction, and it says the concept of the kinesiology section of the MBLEx is focused on assessing the candidate's knowledge, understanding, and application of basic concepts of movement in the body. So concepts of movement, that's built on your knowledge of muscles, where they attach, and your knowledge of joints and how they move, and how joints are put together, and how muscles and bones are put together. MBLEx items will call upon a candidate's ability to apply this knowledge to dissect the exam questions and determine the correct answer. Knowledge of how kinesiology overlaps with anatomy and physiology with regard to the muscular, nervous, and skeletal systems will be beneficial. Candidate preparing for the MBLEx, here we go, is not expected to name actions, attachment sites, and innervation for every muscle in the body. So what do you think that means? Are you going to have to know the actions and attachment sites for some muscles or for none of them?
Some of them.
Yeah.
Yes. Now, how do we figure out which ones we have to learn and which ones we can let go?
That's a good question.
That is a good question. My suggestion is that we start with like the big ones that the ones that are obviously part of the main group. The flexor group of the arm, the flexor group of the hip, the extensor group of the arm, the extensor group of the hip, right? The abductors and abductors, and then the neck and the back, and the abdomen, and then we go from there. And I think that's probably all we would have time for. I could spend all 10 sessions just on the muscles, but hopefully that sounds good to you. So an example of that would be, we might look at, a large view of the muscles of the flexors of the thigh might be saying the hip flexor group, right? And then more specific than that would be the iliopsoas and then the quadriceps. And more specific than that would be the psoas muscle and the iliacus muscle that make up the iliopsoas. And then the muscles that make up the quadriceps group, the rectus femoris, vastus lateralis, medialis, and intermedius. There's 1 or 2 muscles that attach to the ilium that help to flex the hips, such as the sartorius and the tensor fascia lata, but I wouldn't expect you to actually know those. So that's like a third or fourth level of detail. I don't think we should go down that far. You know what I mean? And then like with the lower leg, remember there's the upper limb, the lower limb, the upper leg where the femur and the quadriceps and the hamstrings are, the lower leg where the tibialis anterior and the calf muscles are. So the lower leg is a perfect example of those tiers of knowledge, right? So the muscles in the posterior that plantar flex the ankle and that flex the knee, those include the gastroc and the soleus, and maybe the flexor hallucis brevis, maybe. But we're not going to include, you know, tibialis posterior. What are the other muscles back there? There's one or two other flexor muscles back there. I don't even know. But those are, and then like for the forearm, for example, you know, in my opinion, it's enough to say these are the flexors and these are the extensors. This is the ulnar side. This is the radial side. So these are the radial extensors, and these are the ulnar flexors, rather than you know, flexor carpi ulnaris, extensor digitorum brevis radialis. You know, I mean, I don't know all those names, nor do I need to. I just know which way they go and which side they're on: radial versus ulnar, flexor versus extensor. So it is my job to like clarify those things for you, but you know, hopefully you can see that the FSMTB is intentionally vague, right? They don't want to give you a specific structure so that you have like a direct line to what to study and what to exclude, which would be actually very kind if they did that. But okay, so let's look at a few aspects of muscles. So if you go into your MBLEx folder and you go down to MBLEx March 2023 basics and you open that file, down at the bottom, here's the review of here's the heart information that we had. You can enlarge that pretty easily. There's a section called muscles, and this is the basic stuff about muscles, a summary of the basic stuff about muscles that you should review regularly, because I think you need to know this. Now, this isn't everything. It's not comprehensive. It's just a bunch of stuff that I think you should know. And below that is joints. So let's take a look at let's get like muscle histology and morphology out of the way. I'm sorry, muscle histology and classification. So histo means tissue. Histology is the study of tissues. So when you talk about muscle histology, you're talking about what is a fascicle, what is a sarcomere. Like if we put a muscle under a microscope, what is there? And then when you say classification, things like muscles and joints and bones, they can be classified by either their histology, like how they're built, or they can be built by their structure, which is like the level up from histology. So histology would be like what makes up the cells, and then structure would be how do the cells fit together to make a type of muscle, like a pennate shaped muscle or a circular shaped muscle, right? And then they can also can be classified by function. So if you classify muscles by function, you say voluntary and involuntary, right? So some muscles in the body, they fire only when we voluntarily fire them, and some muscles fire without our having to think about it. You know, the heart, the muscles in the gut, you know, all those. And then there's morphology. So morphology, think of morphing, like changing into a shape. So that's the shape of striated or non-striated or smooth, right? So muscles can be striated or non-striated or smooth. They can be voluntary or involuntary if described by function. When described by type, there are skeletal muscles, which are the muscles, all the muscles we just looked at were skeletal muscles. And those happen to be also striated and voluntary muscles. We have looked at the heart. The heart includes cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle is striated and involuntary. And then there's a third type of muscle in the body, which is smooth muscle, which is non-striated and involuntary. So most people think there's like skeletal and smooth muscle, right? And they're kind of mixing up like the fact that what they're thinking about is striated and not striated and smooth, basically. But they mix up striated and skeletal. So they say skeletal and smooth. But actually, those are two different classification systems. One is the kind of small, let's see, one is the morphology, which is kind of a small shape, or if you look at it closely, what the fibers look like, striated versus smooth. And the other is the type of muscle. If we look at striated versus smooth muscle under a microscope, what we see are that striated muscles have these lines on them and smooth muscles do not. I believe the lines are, I'll have to look up what those are, but I think those are the bands, A bands, Z bands. I'm unclear on, I don't know that stuff very well. And then there's smooth muscles. Smooth muscles don't have those zones that contract like that, so they're smooth. And then the cardiac muscle is sometimes called like somewhere in between, but actually it's striated. It's striated. And this is a thing that I've seen in doing practice tests. This is a thing that I've seen people get confused on, which is that they don't have clear in their minds that striated and smooth is a separate classification system from voluntary and involuntary. And that's a separate system from skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. So I think if you get that, I think it's really important to get that clear so that you do not confuse those. Okay. Let's look at an actual graphic of the muscles. So I think I have one in body systems. Let's see. Let's see if it's in muscular. Yeah, so down at the bottom. Hey, where's that thing? I don't have it. You're kidding. I remember looking at it. I'm sorry, guys. Okay, that's kind of strange. Huh. Okay, so we're going to get more into the histology of the muscle now. Okay, so if we look at oh wait, I think I may be able to find it. No reference for this, which is I pulled this off of the web, like most of my stuff, and it's actually really good reference. Yeah, here we go. All right, so let's put the reference in.
Thanks for waiting. Okay, so muscles are made up of fascicles. So the largest structure is a muscle. And muscles are made up of fascicles, so the next smallest structure is a fascicle. And then fascicles are made up of myofibers or muscle cells. So you have muscles, which are made up of many fascicles. Each fascicle is made up of many muscle cells, and those are called myofibers. Myofibers are made up of bundles of myofibrils, which are cylindrical structures, and then each myofibril is made up of myofilament. And the whole thing is wrapped in sarcomere. So if you look at, sarcolemma. Whole thing is wrapped in a sarcolemma. Okay, so if you look at a muscle, so this whole thing is a muscle, and what you see inside are muscle cells. Muscle cells are inside. So myofibers are inside. So it's a whole muscle, which is made up of fascicles, which is made up of myofibers, and those are made up of myofibrils, which are made up of myofilaments. So let me get this a little larger so you can see it. So here's a myofibril, and the structure larger than that is a myofiber. So this is a myofiber, and several of these structures, several myofibers, would make up a fascicle, and several fascicles together would make a muscle. And when you see this drawing of like actin filaments and myosin filaments, and here we go, H zones and Z discs and M lines and A bands, those are in myofibrils. So myofibrils make up a muscle cell, myofiber. And inside the myofibril is myofilaments. So here we have a muscle. Here's a muscle, and this is one fascicle here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 fascicles, and inside the fascicle are myofibers, which are muscle cells, myofibers. And the myofibers, here's a myofiber. The myofiber is made up of myofibrils, and inside the myofibrils are myofilaments. And the wrapping of a muscle, oops, I misspelled it, is called the sarcolemma. So that's the plasma membrane of the muscle cell. So every muscle cell has a sarcolemma around it. So this muscle cell here is wrapped in a sarcolemma, right? This is showing, I'm seeing I bands, A bands, Z bands, Z discs. So these must be myofibrils, and many myofibrils together make up a myofiber, and the myofiber is wrapped in a sarcolemma. Yeah. So it is utterly confusing, especially if it's not something that you're going to be using on a daily basis in your work. You know what I mean? If you were going to be interacting with this information on a daily basis, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. You would just have it memorized in a short period of time. But we have to put a little bit more work into it than that, because we're not going to be interfacing with it every day, multiple times a day. So you guys repeat after me. You can just do this silently for yourself, okay? A whole muscle is made up of many smaller fascicles. A whole muscle is made up of fascicles. Each fascicle is made up of muscle cells or myofibrils. Each fascicle is made up of muscle cells or myofibers. Myofibers contain cylindrical bundles of myofibrils, So myofibers are made up of myofibrils, and myofibrils are made up of myofilaments. So it's muscle, fascicle, myofiber, myofibril, myofilament. The myofilaments are the ones that contain actin and myosin. Those are the proteins that allow the myofilaments to shorten, which in turn shortens the myofibrils, the fascicles, and then shortens the muscle. Okay, now guys, this is the kind of thing that is basic information that you really need to review almost every day, just in order to have it be reasonably handleable. Right, so you guys try to look at this at least every day until it's much clearer to you, because it's just unfamiliar, you know, and we have to make it familiar in order to remember it. Okay, the striated appearance of skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle is the orderly overlapping of the actin and myosin filaments. Okay, so now we know. All right, any questions? I know that's a lot. I know that's pretty in-depth. Are there any questions about muscle histology? So you guys let me know if any of that needs, yeah, go ahead.
Whereas the functional classification, voluntary, what exactly would that be? Is in movement or?
Well, voluntary means we have mental control over it.
Mental control.
We decide whether it's going to contract or not contract.
Okay.
So for example, in the eye, there are muscles. This is purely just to show you, you don't have to know the muscles of the eye, okay? This is purely just to show you a big difference. All right, so the muscles of the eye, they attach to the back of the eye socket and to the top and the bottom and sides of the eyeball. We have voluntary control over those, and so we can move them left, right, up and down, whatever we want, right? But the muscles inside in the iris that make the pupil and iris, we don't have voluntary control of those. Those are involuntary. So those constrict or relax in a way that is involuntary.
Okay.
And then also,
So basically it's movement on its own when it's involuntary.
that's right. When it's involuntary, is movement on its own. And we have that in, okay, here's a handy little list. So cardiac muscle, obviously your heart beats on its own. And then anything in the intestinal tract, your stomach, your small and large intestines, actually starting around the esophagus, right? Peristalsis starts in the esophagus. And when we swallow the bolus, which is an amount of food, when we swallow the bolus, the peristalsis, without our thinking about it, contracts gradually to push the bolus down into the stomach. Also, our blood vessels, like our arteries have muscles that contract and relax. That's why we have a pulse at the radial artery, the jugular artery, the pes, and the dorsopedilus artery on the foot, the inguinal artery, the urogenital tract. So that's everything from urination to erection, orgasm, and then there's the parturition, birth, right? The respiratory tract. So that's the diaphragm, and also a lot of the secondary muscles, like the scalenes and the intercostal muscles. We don't have to think about contracting those; they move on their own. Those are all involuntary. So you can see, like, if you look at things like the respiratory, the muscles, the secondary muscles of respiration, they may not be smooth muscles, because those are striated muscles that are in between the ribs, for example. But they're also not entirely voluntary. They function involuntarily. So does the diaphragm. You can intentionally move your diaphragm by taking a breath in or out, but you also don't have to think about it. Some people say you can slow down or speed up the heart rate, actually, if you practice it. But again, that is mostly involuntary. Any other questions? Okay, so we're gonna go down to the shapes of muscles, and then we're gonna review our joint movements and planes, and I think that's gonna be all that we're gonna have time for today. I'm just joining the meeting from my phone. That way I can actually see what you guys see. I'm gonna need that feedback in a second. Okay. Okay, all right. So the shapes of skeletal muscles. So parallel or fusiform. Parallel is where the fibers run parallel to each other, and that's what we think of as most of the muscles in the body, or that's what I think of as most of the muscles in the body. So parallel includes, here they're showing the biceps brachii, the sartorius muscle. It also would include like the rectus femoris muscle. It would include, oh no, the rectus femoris is not, the rectus femoris is bipinnate. So let's get a list of fusiform muscles, list of fusiform muscles. It's called fusiform or parallel. The rectus abdominis, biceps brachii, the psoas major, rectus abdominis, many of the SEG or spinal erector group, the gastrocnemius. Let's see. Yeah, gastrocnemius, rectus abdominis, some of the spinal erector groups, the hamstring muscles, gracilis muscle, sartorius muscle, probably the pectineus muscle, psoas. Okay, anyway, you guys get the idea, right? All right, and then there's convergent muscles. So that, for example, is the pectoralis major they're showing. It also would be muscles like the iliacus, the glute medius, glute min. So they have a kind of a lot of attachments on one end, right? So a very broad surface area of attachment on one end that converge to a very narrow surface area attachment on the other end. Can you guys just unmute and name me one or two other convergent muscles? Everybody.
Is a scapula a converted muscle?
Well, the scapula, is that a muscle or a bone?
A bone.
Yes. Is that? I'm sorry, I don't have your names up. I'm getting the. I'll make sure I do that for the next session. But is that Dominique speaking?
That was Khalees.
Khalees. So Khalees, are you thinking about a muscle on the scapula, like the subscapularis?
Yes, that's what I was thinking about.
Okay. Let's see. Subscapularis. So if you look at the fibers of the subscapularis, would you say that that's a long surface area they're attaching to at one end and a narrow surface area at the other?
Yes.
Yeah.
They're converging, yeah. So it'd be the subscapularis, yeah. And then
Okay.
if you look at the back, you can see that the infraspinatus is also convergent, right? A long or wide surface area of attachment on one end, tapering to a narrow, converging to a narrow area of attachment on the other end. Okay, and then the orbicularis oris, we don't really need to review all those, but that's any circular muscle in the body, right? So that would be the mouth, the eyes, the rectum, and then there's also, I believe, the cardiac sphincter, the one that closes off the esophagus from the stomach. I believe that's also an orbicularis, also a circular muscle. The name of the muscle around the mouth is the orbicularis oris, and that is a circular muscle. So orbic like orbit, orbicularis, circling, oris like oral, like mouth, versus orbicularis oculi, like eye. So the ones around the eye that squinch the eye, that's the oculus muscle, and the ones around the mouth, that's the oris muscle, and they're both orbicularis in shape. Deltoid muscles are, wait, let's come back to those. So those are multipennate muscles. Let's first look at unipennate muscle. So an example is the extensor digitorum longus, but I believe also the tibialis anterior muscle. So let's look at the tibialis anterior. So a unipennate muscle. No, that's a fusiform muscle. They're not going to ask you, I don't think, is this fusiform or is it, you know, what muscle fiber is it? They might ask you though, well, what's the difference in terms of power between a fusiform muscle and a pennate muscle? And then they'll give you choices. The choices are usually something like, you know, the fusiform muscle allows for more pulling strength from one end to another, versus the bipennate muscle has less pulling strength one end to another, but a lot more stability because of multiple attachments along the bone. So let's look at that now. So pennate muscles. Yeah, so unipennate muscles include the extensor digitorum longus muscle, and I don't think that I don't think you have to know exactly which ones are pennate, which ones are unipennate and bipennate and all that. But I just want you guys to have an idea. So it's called a pennate muscle because of the shape. It looks like a feather, right? The shape is quite like a feather, and the only example that I'm able to find really is that extensor muscles in the leg. Okay, I was trying to avoid doing that, but it looks like I'm not going to be able to. So extensor digitorum longus. Yeah, okay, here they are side by side. So here's the tibialis anterior muscle. I hope you guys can see the fibers. Here's the tibialis anterior. It goes like this. This is the extensor digitorum longus. This is also the peroneal muscle. And the fibers are going this way. They're going in a slight diagonal. And you guys see how I'm moving the cursor diagonal?
Yeah.
Maybe you guys can't see that.
Yes, see.
Cannot see it. Maybe this will be better. Can you see the fiber directions on this drawing?
Yeah.
Yeah, you see the
Yes.
stripes, right?
Yes.
Yeah, especially down here, the lower half, you can really see those stripes. It's kind of like a feather, so unipennate, right? Extensor digitorum, also called the peroneus longus. All right, unipennate, and then bipennate. An example of the bipennate muscle is the biceps femoris. Let's see. I always have to say biceps femoris versus rectus femoris. So it's the rectus femoris, and then the sartorius muscle and the gracilis in the same area. Those are parallel muscles or fusiform muscles. And then that brings us to multipennate. So you have the single pennate, unipennate, the two pennates, so bipennate. See the fibers are, there's like a center line and they're going out from each other. And then there's multipennate, which are several strands of what look like bipennate muscles, and that's the deltoid muscle. Let's take one closer look. So notice in a lot of drawings, if you look at the deltoid muscle, it just looks like what kind of shape? Fusiform or convergent? Looks convergent. But in fact, if you look closer, here we go. If you look closer, it actually has both types of fibers. It has convergent fibers and it has multi-pennate fibers. Very interesting and tricky. Okay, that's all the muscle fiber shapes. Yeah. Great, so next time we're going to go over joints. So now let's finish up with our orientation terms and our planes, and that probably will be all we do. Actually, no orientation. We'll do planes and we'll do joint movements.
Yeah.
If you guys are wondering what I'm doing, I have my iPhone over here so that I can see. And I have this camera over here. Wow, it's really gotten dark. 2 hours ago, the sunlight was actually intense, and now it's like cloudy day. Okay, so frontal plane of the body. Hey, that this thing. And that just shut off. Battery's out. Oh my god. My battery's dead. Okay, I have to do this. I have to do this using the FaceTime camera.
See you.
And that's just that, fortunately. Okay, so. Okay, great. So the frontal plane is also called the coronal plane, right? And if you abduct or adduct, if you abduct the arms, you
Abduct.
the head, yes, which is the corona. So that contains abduction and adduction, right? Adding to the midline and abducting away from the body. Frontal plane or coronal plane also contains lateral flexion for the neck, lateral flexion or side flexion for the spine, as well as abduction and adduction for the hip. Okay. You guys make sure that you like stand up and do these movements with me. Okay. Let's see. Then for the sagittal plane goes this way, right? So the sagittal plane contains flexion of the shoulder. Remember, this is flexion of the shoulder, and this is extension of the shoulder. This is neutral. Now I'm into the extension, back to neutral. Now I'm in flexion. Flexion of the shoulder also contains flexion of the hip.
Flexion,
Of the hip.
extension.
Yep. And it also would contain, sagittal would also contain flexion of the knee, extension of the knee, dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, dorsiflexion. Sagittal plane. Sagittal would also include hip flexion, hip extension, and spine flexion, spine extension, neck flexion, neck extension. Let's see. Okay, and then horizontal plane, also called the transverse plane, contains horizontal abduction, horizontal adduction. Also contains rotation through the spine, rotation through the hip joint, and rotation through the neck. The neck is part of the spine, but you get the idea. All right, and then let's do a little joint movement, right? So we have flexion and extension of the elbow. We did flexion and extension of the shoulder, flexion and extension of the shoulder, right? And then flexion and extension of the elbow. And we have flexion of the wrist, extension of the wrist. Remember the orientation term, this is supination. This is supination and this is pronation. Right? Flexion and extension of the wrist. For the wrist, there's also a special term, which is ulnar deviation and radial deviation. So a little bit closer, that's ulnar deviation and radial deviation. This is the radius, and this is the ulna. Ulnar and radial deviation. Remember your orientation terms for the palm. This is also called the volar surface as well as the palmar surface. And this is the dorsum or the dorsal surface. Anatomical position is always facing forward with the palms facing forward out like this and the feet separated like that. That way we're always clear on which way is spine flexion and which way is spine extension. It becomes more difficult to mix those up. Okay, protraction or retraction of the shoulder blades is shrugging the shoulders, or I'm sorry, is extending, like pushing out, like you're doing a push-up. So that's protraction of the shoulder blades. This is retraction of the shoulder blades, where you squeeze your shoulder blades together. Right. Another way of visualizing that is that protraction hollows the chest, and then retraction opens the chest. Elevation and depression of the shoulder blade. So elevation raises the shoulders, raises the shoulder blades, and then depression lowers the shoulder blades. When you elevate, you're using your upper traps. When you depress, you're using your latissimus dorsi. Okay, one more, and then we have to call it a day. And that's going to be inversion and eversion of the foot. So inversion and eversion of the foot. There's my sleeping dog. So this is inversion, and this is eversion. Inversion and eversion. I wanted to do this one because I want you to remind you that they both contain 3 different movements. So inversion of the foot contains supination. So that this bottom surface, plantar surface, is starting to supinate. Right. So there's supination. There's also adduction toward the midline, and there's a little bit of plantar flexion. So there's adduction, plantar flexion, and supination all together. And those give us inversion. Eversion looks like that. So that's eversion. And there's a little bit of dorsiflexion. You see the dorsiflexion in eversion? There's abduction, and there's also pronation. So the bottom of the foot is starting to come up, and that's pronation, or the top is starting to go down, pronation. Pronation, dorsiflexion, and abduction. For eversion, and then for inversion, it's pronation, and then a deduction, and then plantar flexion. Okay, guys, thanks for hanging in there with the equipment failure today. And I'll see you tomorrow. You guys text me if there's any questions. I'm still working on getting the other classes up online, and you'll get links to those when I have them for you, okay? So we'll see you tomorrow at 11 o'clock Eastern time. Bye.
All right, have a good one.
All right. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.